The film that follows is the recording of a talk given by Mary Thomson, formerly Mary Sara, about the artist and her friend Dorothy Bradford. Ilkley Manor House hosted an exhibition of Dorothy Bradford's work up until the end of October 2022, and this talk opened that exhibition.
Oh, thank you for that welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. And I see a lot of familiar faces who, like me, have become a little less familiar over the years, but still recognisable and nice smiles of welcome. So thank you all for coming. I also know that quite a few of you knew Dorry probably as I did in the 80s in Ilkley, and so some of what I have to say will be quite familiar to you. It won't necessarily be new. But first I'd like to thank Rachel, Dorothy's daughter, for actually inviting me to do this talk today. I jumped at it. I jumped at the chance to come back to Ilkley. And thank you to Sarah for all the work that the friends do here at the Manor House. My talk today falls into several strands, but they all overlap. So it's not chronological, it's not a survey, but I hope by the end of my talk you'll feel if you didn't know Dorry before, and we've got to call her Dorry, none of us called her Dorry. If you didn't know her or her work, you'll feel you knew both. Certainly the person behind the art, in Dorry's case, is very important. I think it's always important. So I'll talk about why I'm here today, talk about my friendship, Dorothy's early background, importance of her drawing, and of course the various subjects that you can see around us in the gallery today, and why they were important to her, why she chose them. Whereas I like to think they sort of chose her because of who she was. So all of that I have to say, I hope, will increase your enjoyment and understanding of the exhibition. For those of you at home, it will encourage you to actually come and see it before it closes at the end of October. Yes. So first of all, those of you who don't know me, why have I been parachuted in today from Glasgow? Why me? So a brief overview of why me will just give you that connection. In the 1980s, I owned and ran a little gallery called the Hawksworth Gallery on Hawksworth Street. Not very original title, I agree, but at least people knew where I was. And many of you will have walked down that little street from the main car park today. And I ran it only for 5 years, but it seems to have stuck in people's memory, perhaps because they came and they saw a lot of good exhibitions, so I think they did. And during that time I met Dorothy, and I exhibited her work, and she became a good friend. I think I first exhibited her work in 1986. And I remember I hung one room, it was a front room, with pictures of musicians and dancers, and in the back room I had horses and birds, and I can prove it. I have here a photograph which was taken for the Yorkshire Post before I had a strong connection with the paper. I think it was an article for the Woman's Post, 1986, woman running a gallery in Ilkley, news. Anyway, it was good publicity. And as you can see, there was a piano in the back of the gallery, which some of you may remember. It did create a nice atmosphere at one or two previews if someone would sit and play it. But in the background, if you pick this up later, you'll see there's 3 paintings, and they're Dorothy's. And there are 3 paintings of horses. I haven't had time to check whether they're actually here today, but they might just be. So that's a challenge. If you can find the paintings, good luck to you, but they might just well be on. Gosh, I wish I still looked like that. 40 years ago, goodness. So that was the Hawksworth Gallery. That's just the little gallery at the back room. So I had as I say, I hung the exhibition for Dorry, and I waited for her to come thinking, oh, would she like the hang? But of course she did. She was always very amenable and helpful. And as I said, any room with Dorry in it turned into a party. It was a good preview, I seem to remember. I kept in touch with Dorry when she moved to Nantwich in Cheshire, despite leaving Ilkley, and despite me moving as well, I moved first of all to Ilkley, then up to Nidderdale, and then up to Scotland in 2005, I still kept in touch. And after I closed my gallery, I did so in order to concentrate on writing about art, rather than showing it and selling it. So that's another reason why I'm here today, and not someone else standing up talking to you. I wrote the catalogue essay, or the book, which you will see is on display at the back there, this book, which I have in my hand. There's some copies at the back and they're for sale. And she invited me to do that, I think it was 2003, which I was very pleased to do. So I've written extensively about her work. So that's another reason why it's me today. And we took the title of the exhibition, or Rachel decided that, from the title of the book, Rhythms of Life. So, as I say, the reason Dorothy asked me to do that was not just based on friendship, it was just based on her knowing about my writing about art as well. So, after my gallery days on Hawksworth Street, I then spent the next 15 years in Yorkshire writing about art, mostly for the Yorkshire Post to start with. I had a weekly column, a lot of reviewing. I got to know the M62 between Hull and Liverpool extremely well, because I did all of the galleries between those two points in the north of England and all the little ones in between. Sometimes if I got into the Pennines, I think, have I done Headton Bridge, or am I in? Because they began to all look the same, but they all had little galleries at that time, and a lot of them were showing very interesting work. They were worth reviewing. So that was my writing life for the Yorkshire Post. But gradually I was commissioned to do more and more of the sort of work I did for Dorothy. Catalogue essays, books, extended criticism for, as a freelance, for national magazines and so on. So I made my living as a freelance writer for quite years. And some of you may have known me as well from my years at Harwood. At Harwood House, I worked there for a while, as sort of with the curatorial team. I kind of did events and workshops around the exhibitions, and I helped curate exhibitions there as well, and also wrote some of the interpretation, both for the house and for the contemporary and historic art exhibitions there. So that's another connection that I have with Ilkley. Of course, I lived here for a long time, 13 years altogether. So how did I first meet Dorothy? Well, as I say, I met her through her exhibiting with me, but I actually met her through a friendship with another artist who some of you might remember, Margaret Firth. Does anyone remember Margaret and her work? Yes, I see some nods, good. Margaret, I got to know through, who was that? Mira, the weaver in Addingham. Mira Stockel said, you've got to see Margaret Firth's work. So I went to see Margaret. Thought, wow, yes, terrific. Gave her first exhibition in Ilkley, I think, for many years. And then that took off, and it sort of established Margaret in the public eye again, and her work became very collectible. But she introduced me to Dorothy, because they were good friends from when Dorothy lived in Ilkley. And I gather that they came here in 1950, I think, yes, around there. 48, 50, the family moved to Ilkley. In fact, Rachel, you were born here, I think, yes. So there's a long connection there, and then moved again in the 80s.
63. You left, you actually moved away.
Ah, sorry, right, yes, thank you. My historian at the back there. But Margaret and Dorothy were good friends, although they were totally opposite in temperament. And I think Margaret was about 20 years older. I have a wonderful photograph here, taken on a unique occasion at the Manor House. Do have a look at this later. I don't know who wrote this. Oh, by the way, it's MS, that must have been me. Yes, I wrote this for, I think it's the Ilkley Gazette by the looks of it. Margaret had an exhibition here in this room, and it was co-curated with John Sheeran, who used to work for Bradford Art Galleries at that time. And it toured, it went to Huddersfield, and then it went to Abbots Hall. It was a beautiful exhibition. And this is taken on the occasion of the opening, and there's the arts officer for Bradford there, and then there's Richard Morford, keeper of the modern art collection at the Tate at that time, who was a cousin of Margaret's. And you'll see Margaret in her sensible best coat. And you'll see Dorry next to her with her shock of white hair, and I think probably turquoise silk or something equally dashing, I remember. And it just shows their friendship, but also the contrast in their personalities and in their work. Margaret produced these beautifully serene, quiet, studied still lives, and Dorothy was all about music and sociability and expression. So do have a look at that. I haven't actually reread the piece, so make no claims for it. Just that one. So there we have the friendship established between Margaret and Dorothy, and I was sort of in between them as another friend. As I said last night at the opening, there's a significance about this exhibition being here in the Manor House, because in 1950, Dorothy was appointed as art advisor to Ilkley Council. Now, can you imagine that happening today? And I gather from your chuckles you think not. And as a result of that, she set up a committee and organised contemporary art exhibitions here in Ilkley at the Winter Gardens. Because at that time, this building was in use for people living in it in flats. It was all subdivided, and it was in a pretty poor state of repair. So that was the beginning of art exhibitions in Ilkley. And in 1962, Bradford Council stepped in, took over this building, restored it, and began to use it as a museum and gallery. So there's a strong connection between Dorothy's years in Ilkley and the fact that we're here today. So Dorothy, as I say, was younger than Margaret by 20 years, but Dorry's family became Margaret's family because Margaret didn't have any children and had never married. So there was very strong friendship there. Another thing that drew these two together were some very important lectures given in Leeds by the famous artist, writer, critic, Maurice de Saumarez. If you look him up, you'll find he was very well known at the time. And he was appointed the first fine art lecturer at Leeds University, I think. But in 1951, he did a series of free public lectures on art. And for people like Margaret and Dorry, who'd never had the chance to go to art school for various reasons, these were an absolute godsend, because here was some serious lectures about art that they could attend for free. And they weren't the only people to remember them. I remember various artists talking about them in the same vein, who used to come to my gallery and talk to me about the good old days. And they would often mention these very same lectures by Maurice de Saumarez. I think what was important about them for both artists and for many people is that his writing and his lectures about art were very much people-centred. It was about the artist behind the art. And so they were very insightful lectures, apparently, about art from all periods, from the Renaissance through to the present day. But what mattered was the artist behind the images. And I would like to have heard them, I must say. I read some of his writing briefly, and it really is very interesting. It's worth looking up. And the two of them often went to exhibitions together, and Dorothy must have been a really good companion for Margaret on those occasions. I don't think Margaret would have got round to doing it on her own. And their friendship continued when Dorothy and Don and the family moved to, first of all, to Formby, and then to Nantwich in Cheshire. So I was very fortunate to be able to continue my friendship with Dorry because I did it through visits to Cheshire. I came from Cheshire originally, and so I have relatives still living in Cheshire. So I go and do the sort of relatives bit, then treat myself to a visit to Dorry in the afternoon or before I came home. And it was always a warm welcome, and it was wonderful to see what she was working on at any one time, and to look at her drawings and to talk about art and music and poetry. And yes, I was very fortunate to be able to continue the friendship in that way, but also through phone calls over the years. So our friendship continued over the next decades, despite the fact that I kept moving as well. I moved up to Nidderdale, and latterly to Scotland. So as a critic, the artist behind the art has always been important to me. The more I could tell people about the artist, the more I felt they could come to some understanding of the images that they were looking at. So true art is never anonymous. There's always a fingerprint, there's always a signature, if you like, and that signature is theirs and theirs alone. And that's why, we need to look at art from that point of view, not art historical, not art critical, but actually who made it and why. And that's what I'd like to sort of come to eventually here. So the standout paintings in any show, whether it's amateur, if it's kind of the sort of mixture of things you've got next door, the standout things are ones that come from a sort of inner necessity, have to be made. That there's no way the person who made that could not have made it. There was a kind of urgency about the need to express an idea, to make something of their experience, of their life experience. So back to Dorry herself, her early background. You've got a kind of précis in your hands, I think, and you'll also find it in the book. But just to go over that, to remind you where she started. She was born in 1918 in Cockermouth. There was art in the family. Her father was a teacher of art. And apparently, reputedly, her mother's great uncle exhibited at the Royal Academy. I don't know any more about it than that, but it's sort of in the family history, like these sort of rumours of the past often are. Dorry apparently drew from a very early age. And the interesting thing is that the first things that anyone remembers her drawing as a small child are other children skipping, movement. And she also, apparently, drew them from the feet up, which I think is very unusual for a child to draw from the feet. Then it's from the feet that everything happens, isn't it? So I find that a really interesting thing to know about Dorry as a child. She knew she wanted to be an artist, not an art teacher, and she enrolled in evening classes at Liverpool College of Art. She had to leave school and get a job because her father died and she was needed to help with the family finances. So she wasn't able at that stage to go to art school proper, but she went to evening classes at Liverpool College of Art. She would be in her late teens, early 20s when she found work at a department store in Liverpool. The department store was called Bon Marché. Now we're talking about the 1940s here, late 1930s, 1940s. I don't know if any of you would remember Liverpool at that time. It's just before I was born, this particular piece of paper. But that's where she found work, and apparently she was, this is written in 1942, it's a reference I'll come back to, temporary position for 10 months as chief clerk to our publicity office and secretary to the publicity manager. So that was the job she took as a young married woman. Her name was, by this time, Mrs. Bradford. I'll come back to how they describe her in this letter in a moment. So she got the job, then war broke out. During the war, there was no newsprint available, very, very limited amounts of newsprint. So a big part of her job, which was newspaper advertising for the shop, had gone. Now, Bon Marché at the time was well known, it had French connections, excuse me. It was well known for a promotion of the arts and putting on exhibitions in the stores, which is unusual, isn't it? Would that more would do that today. And Dora's job then devolved into something quite different. So to fill the gap left by the lack of advertising in newspapers, she was deputed to put on an exhibition at the store. And an exhibition of arts, I'll read this because it's important, an exhibition of the arts and crafts of the Allied countries was proposed. And it was the young Dorry who was given the job of borrowing works from the Wallace collection, from the Lady Lever Art Gallery, and even the Allied consulates for this exhibition at the Bon Marché store, which is fascinating to think of, isn't it, during the war years? And I could just imagine her absolutely loving the job, wouldn't you? Just going through these famous collections and choosing items for an exhibition. And I think it probably gave her a very interesting introduction to the art of curating a show and things that would hang well together. So it gave her close-up and first-hand knowledge of two very good collections, and, as I say, exhibition experience. Now, during the war years, there was an organisation called CEMA, C-E-M-A, rather ponderously titled Council for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts. Now, it was the forerunner of today's Arts Council, but it was set up during the war to promote exhibitions, concerts, cultural activities of various kinds throughout the United Kingdom, wherever it was possible to do so, to bring culture to the people who needed sort of the sustenance of beauty, of music, of art. And it was very successful in doing that, as far as I understand it. Now, Dorry, being Dorry, decided that she'd had enough of Liverpool and was ready for something else. And she wrote to the organisation CEMA in London and said, I like what you're doing, I'd like a job. And she sent details of her experience, which was probably minimal, but enough. And she got a job with them straight away, and she left Liverpool for London. But I would like to read you a piece of a very wonderful reference that was written for her, which I've only just been given by Rachel last night. It's just brilliant. I'm going to read it all. This was the reference from General Manager of Bon Marché stores. To all whom it may concern, Mrs. Dorothy Bradford has occupied with us a temporary position for 10 months as Chief Clerk to our Publicity Office and Secretary to the Publicity Manager. This joint job demands initiative, enterprise, and an all-round capability. These Mrs. Bradford has supplied, and I have no hesitation in testifying that she is a young woman of exceptional capacity. In addition, she has a great gift of consolidating personal relationships in such a way that she works amiably and well with all types and ages and both sexes. I would like to add that there has been no one in the business I am more sorry to lose, but I realise she should be used in work of national service. What a reference. I mean, even if they've given her the job already, that is pretty good, isn't it? So I do encourage you to have a look at that later. It's a terrific read. So there's Dorry, young Dorry, going down to London. And not only was the new job very stimulating and exciting, but it gave her, being in London, opportunities to engage with a cultural life that she'd not experienced before. And she took every opportunity with eager hands. As well as the job, she did daytime and evening classes at St. Martin's School of Art. She did life classes at Central School. Now, of course, many students and teachers at that time were away. They were fighting, they were in forces. Those that were left behind, for whatever reason, were very keen to engage with anybody who wanted to learn. So there was a lot going on, in fact. It's quite interesting to read about those war years in the great cities, but particularly London. And they were keen to keep their studios open, and they were keen to keep on teaching. So when you read about this period in London life, it's quite surprising how much was actually happening in terms of music and recitals and ballet performances. And Dorry went to them, and she drew, and she drew. Most often during rehearsals. For example, she drew dancers in rehearsal, and she would watch performances from the back of the dress circle and would draw there. She drew Margot Fontaine, Frederick Ashton, Robert Helpman. Anyone who knows anything about dance, those were the standout names of dance for many decades in Britain. And drawing in rehearsal was incredibly important because repetition gave her time to capture in fluid, rapid lines the essence of a dancer's movement. You'll see I've put on the easel there one of her wonderful drawings. You can imagine that movement just from those lines. And I think there are more drawings of dancers around, and Rachel would. Have you got them with you today, Rachel? Yes, to show if you're particularly interested in those. She also began the lifelong habit of drawing musicians. We have a number of musicians on the walls with us today, which is wonderful to see. And she drew them in rehearsal too, because again, with repetition, she was able to see something happening over and over and over again, which is perfect if you want to draw and try to capture. And she also said that she knew she'd be a distraction if she drew at performances, and that would have been the case. Another great benefit to her was developing her knowledge and her taste in music. Again, she learned that through listening to the changes in interpretation that were brought to bear on a performance in rehearsal, which is always very interesting if ever got a chance to listen to an orchestra rehearsing a piece. As she herself said, music needs time and repetition to get the sense of the thing as a whole. And I think you see that in some of her paintings where you'll see multiple images of the same player. There's one over there, you can see the violinist, and in various positions, all of which add up to kind of a sense of a performance. Now, her role in the job in London brought her into contact with many of the best contemporary artists of the day who were involved in setting up the exhibitions and curating them. And she said, just by simply listening to people in meetings, wonderful opportunity to learn and to understand more about art. So now I'd like to talk about Dorry and her drawings. There's a number in the print bins at the exhibition, and there are others for sale and to look at in the various cabinets. As I say, she'd drawn from very, very, very early age. All children draw. All children should be encouraged to draw. But I think that story about her drawing children skipping and from the feet up show that this was an exceptionally gifted child. It's also a very early example of her fascination with bodies in movement, which you see around us, and with other things, subjects in movement as well. So she attended classes in London, and she would have attended classes with tutors who were brought up in the traditional academies of drawing, basically. They would all have been taught to draw, and they would then pass those skills on to their students. A tradition which sadly has been broken in the last few decades in art schools on the whole. I've known students, for example, at Glasgow School of Art, I've met through being a member of the Glasgow School of Art choir, who said to me, I wish we'd been taught to draw. They didn't draw at school for the A-levels, and they weren't being taught at Glasgow School of Art, which is a terrible indictment. I rant over. It's such a foundational skill, I believe. So Dorry said one paints something in order to know it, in order to see it. And that goes for drawing too. And for Dorry, painting almost always began with a drawing. Drawing makes you look closely, to analyse what you see, look again to interpret what you see, and look again to try and capture what you see. So it's a very focused activity. You look, you analyse, and you describe in whatever medium you choose. Drawing, I think, also acts as an impulse to memory. if we return to the act of looking when we look back at our drawings, we are going back to that process of analysing and describing. So it's a memoir, it's a memory moment when we refer to our drawings. Whenever I visited Dorry in either her studio or in her home in Nantwich, there would be nowhere to put your coffee cup because our drawings would be everywhere. The folders and albums of drawings and the sketchbooks would be everywhere. And she'd always be referring, oh, this one, oh, and this one. And they would always be ready for her to start work on a painting or to just remember the moment when she was in that room with those musicians, or when she was, I'll come to the pigeons, the birds and the horses later. But, it was always everywhere. The drawings were a vital source for her. And at the time, I really don't remember her selling drawings. They were always kept in the sketchbooks. They weren't drawn for sale, in other words. Sometimes she would work from drawings done many years earlier. She did a wonderful portrait of the conductor Maxim Shostakovich, conducting his father's work from a drawing done 30 years earlier. And the painting is as fresh as if she'd heard it yesterday. Remarkable, sort of the bridge in the years, the memory of being there, experiencing that moment with that music, with those musicians in that room, and the painting that resulted was quite remarkable. So how can this be? How can drawings be such a powerful resource for an artist? And Dorry herself, when I asked her this, said that after a period of time, the drawings, the sense of voyeurism recedes. And she could see the performers, the musicians or the dancers in a more abstract way. She could discard the trivia and get to the true reality of what was happening there and then when she was drawing, as I said. And she also said, the music helps the drawing. You start and finish in the right place in relation to the phrase of music, which is quite an interesting idea. She also told me more than once that drawing was a daily discipline that never left her. And she once told me that when she was a very busy young mother, she actually ended the day by drawing the toweling nappies that were drying on a clothes rack by the fire, because she had to draw something. She also told me, I was talking about drawing, you draw what's in front of you, whatever it is, wherever you are. She drew some lovely sketches presumably when she was in hospital having children, of hospital nurses chatting around a trolley, a doctor sitting on a bed with a patient. You get my drift. She's always got a sketchbook with her. And it's a practice which confirms what I've always been told, just draw what's in front of you, wherever you find yourself. To go back to her drawings of dancers in particular, they're like annotations of choreography to me. If you are a dancer yourself, you would know what these movements were called and how you arrived at them just by seeing these rapidly scribbled lines. And the liveliness is got the strength of the body and the suppleness of the movement. Now, she continued drawing dancers, and there's something I'd like to refer to here. The Yorkshire Ballet Seminars, do some of you remember those taking place in Ilkley? Remember in the 1980s? They were very well known, weren't they? Very famous opportunities for dancers, young dancers, to come to train. They were held up at Ilkley College, as it then was. And young dancers to come and work with some of the most famous teachers available, big names. And Dorry was invited to draw the student dancers while they were in occupation up there. And there's currently a book in preparation by Kathy Birch, who's here today. And there's some details about it on the table here. And it's going to be a book about the ballet seminars, I understand, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And hoping to publish in the spring. Yeah. Yes. So do have a look at that. So in the connection today is because some of Dorry's drawings will illustrate the book, which is a rather nice connection with the past. So when she came to dance and dancers as her subject, she had, I think, kind of muscle memory of doing the drawing, and as well as having the drawings in front of her. Movement is life, she told me when I was writing the book about her. And that's absolutely what she was about as an artist. So then to turn to kind of how she painted, the style in which she painted, how she applied the paint. And given time with any one of her paintings, you become aware of the movement of the arm and the hand, of where she was standing in relation to the canvas. And as far as I remember, she always worked from an easel and stood. And you can see or can sense the application of the paint, the eagerness, the energy, and the direction of the movement, which follows the movement of the subject. And I think it's there very much so in the lovely paintings of pigeons, which we've got in the exhibition, which I'll come to shortly. She moved the paint about. Sometimes it was quite fluid and thinly applied, but in kind of bright colours, sometimes thicker, very often in a very limited palette, just a few colours, and then there'll be a bright splash of, for example, there's a cello player, which you can see those of you who are in the room. Most of it's blues and greys, but that instrument, you can hear it in the colour. If you've got an idea, red means something warm and strong, it's there in her choice of colours. If you bear that in mind as you go around the exhibition, or you look at the book, when you take one home, then you'll see that in action. We have a painting of a horn player. We're very lucky. There it is. My husband Raymond is here with me today, and he's a player of the French horn. And this painting was actually in Nantwich Church on the occasion of the sort of memorial service to Dorry, which we were at. And it was just mind-blowing. It was just up there on a kind of pillar high up, because there was an exhibition of Dorry's work in the town at the time. And we now have it. And we have it against a deep yellow wall. And it just sings because of the wonderful golden tones that she's used throughout, which not only describe the instrument, but the sound it makes, to my mind. Those golden, strong tones. And it's actually of a famous horn player,
Alan Seville.
Alan Seville. And if you knew him, I think you'd recognise him. I've seen photographs of him. But it's the horn player to us. And it's a wonderful thing to have in our living room. So I think she saw sound in terms of colour relationships. And just as a sound on its own means nothing, unless it's got another sound next to it, or a silence, then a colour means nothing unless it's got another colour next to it. And she described that quite interestingly to me. She used a musical analogy for her compositions. In a painting, I need it to sing. The whole thing must do something that is indescribable in words. The thing as a whole must work. So what we're getting at is it's not just a description of a moment or an event. And as I say, you'll notice that to achieve that unity, to make a painting sing, she kept the number of colours very often quite limited, but they're very harmonic colour relationships, very discriminating use of dynamic colours and contrasts. Now, occasionally, particularly in her later years, instead of using drawings, she would start with the paint on a piece of board and just push it about to see what happened, to see what emerged. It was usually figures, but something would kind of lead her to make something of the colours that were on her brush and on the painting itself. So she was working more intuitively, I think, and I think on a smaller scale, because it was becoming more difficult to stand and paint at an easel. So she was improvising. So let's come to how music was so important to her. She told us that it had been vital since she was a schoolgirl, and she used to queue for the cheapest seats at St. George's Hall in Liverpool. This would be pre-war, this would be in the 1930s. And when she was in her early 20s and living in London, she described going to hear Bach's St. Matthew Passion for the first time. This is how she described how it affected her. It was not just like a river of emotion and beauty running past. I was aware of the structure, how everything mattered to the whole, the architecture, the geometry. After that, I heard everything in a different way. Apparently, she walked home from the Albert Hall to Hampstead so as not to lose that intense feeling. Oh, to be that young again. She talked a great deal and very vivaciously and very knowledgeably about music when you went to visit. And perhaps most pertinent to what we see in her paintings of music, and musicians rather, is this remark that I recorded about what she tried to capture, which was, and I quote, "The emotional forces of what has occurred that remains in the silence after the reverberations of sound has finished." You know that moment at the end of a concert, you're all, and then some idiot claps too soon or coughs and that moment is broken. It has to be broken, but it's a very important part to me of a whole evening or experience of music, and that's what she's talking about. It's that feeling that before the silence is broken, that memory that you carry. So from that earliest recollection of concerts in Liverpool, she then went to watching great orchestras in London during the war years. So she was very, very lucky in what she was able to hear. I also remember that when she was in Nantwich in her later years, that she would go to just about anything and everything that was put on by the local music society. Recitals by quartets would visit in a local church, and Dorry would be there. And she'd be there in the afternoons when they were rehearsing. She would ask if she could. So she enjoyed a lot of music there too. So it was this passion that drove her, not ambition. But in 1971, this was very important to her, she was invited to tour as the official artist with the new Philharmonia Orchestra and their conductor, Sir Charles Groves. There's a nice story about that moment. Her acutely observed and rapid drawings of his players elicited the remark from him to the effect that he recognised all his players in her drawings, even if it was a drawing of the full orchestra. He knew them all. He could tell who they were from these rapid scribbles that she did. She returned the compliment by saying he was one of the very few conductors she actually knew, who knew actually all of his players, could name them, which is quite telling if you think about it. She was also official artist of the Leeds Piano Competition from 1975 onwards. I think she did it more than once. I certainly remember an exhibition at Leeds University Gallery, which would have been in the 80s, during the time when the Leeds Piano Competition was on. The University Gallery, Hilary Diaper was the curator at that time, put an exhibition of Dorry's work on and linked it with the programme that was going on for the piano competition. So she was able to express the dynamics of a soloist, a quartet, orchestra, groups of players, and the energy and the fire of conductors. I think some of her studies of conductors are very revealing of their nature and their character. Another subject for Dorry, because she was a very sociable person, are people. People enjoying themselves, people relaxing, people at bars, people sort of leaning and chatting and walking. And they're some of her most intimate subjects, I think. And they reflect her love of life and her, as I say, her very sociable character. She had an interest in people, fellow men, genuine interest. And she made this remark, which I thought was very, very interesting. She drew in many situations. She said, if they are careful about what they're doing, they are fascinating. Whether it's a road sweeper or a dancer, it's about concentration. So you also see that in the studies of people, where people are listening, or walking, or grouped together in a bar or a restaurant. There is something about that concentration, that joint feeling of being together and listening to each other. So I think those paintings are some things that really give me great delight, because they bring her back to me as a person. I'll come to the paintings of pigeons that are on the walls here. I'll never forget visiting Dory's studio in Nantwich, which was in a kind of loft. I think it was an abandoned building in the middle of the town that nobody knew what to do with. And she took over the top floor as a studio. It was a wonderful space. It was a bit bleak. And I think the pigeons had been there before her, been swept out. But they were roosting above and on the windowsills. And they were swooping around the courtyard below. So she was watching them slightly from above a lot of the time. And she was absolutely fascinated and loved them. And I think they're very, very touching and delightful. She loved those birds. She wasn't going to be one who shooed them away and put barbed wire on the windowsill or whatever you do to try and stop pigeons coming close to where you live. She really did enjoy them. And again, it was about the movement. Pigeons are always about to flutter, aren't they? They're never still for long. And I think they're amongst some of her nicest paintings in the room. Again, for me personally, they bring back a memory of being with her in the studio on that day. I've always thought she was trying to catch them in flight, like she was trying to catch a dancer going across the stage, just the same. She was after their movement, that essence. And the same is true with the wonderful paintings of horses that she did, which, again, are about movement, but I think they're also about the power of that animal, grace, power, and the relationship between rider and horse. There are some very nice studies of just horses, but I think the most interesting and important ones reflect that relationship you see here behind me. Wonderful painting. And remember I talked about those flashes of colour, which were meant to be expressive of emotion, if you like. When you look at this, there's an underpainting of red that's allowed, and then she's gone and actually defined it even further by adding to it on top. The whole painting, I think, is based on kind of a pale red, and then this comes through. And then she's added squiggles of paint. You can actually see it drying on the surface to just bring out that sense of passion, movement, energy, force. Dory never stopped working. How am I doing for time by that? Oh, Dory never stopped working right until the last days of her long life. In fact, just before she died, she was hanging an exhibition in Nantwich. She died at the age of 90. People were still coming to her studio up to that moment to buy her paintings and for her company, which they liked and loved as much as they did her painting. And perhaps I'd have written about that exhibition if I'd still been an art critic for a local paper to help people to enjoy that experience. I'll just tell you a little story now to sort of wrap up the talk. I once wrote an exhibition review of Barry Flanagan's sculptures at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. He made these big bronzes of hares that seemed to be, about to lollop across the grass and into the woods. And I wrote a 600-word review, or even less. I was never given very much space for those in the paper. And somebody came into the gallery later and said to me, "You realise, don't you, that review you wrote about Barry Flanagan was actually a poem?" Really? And I looked at it again, and it was. It didn't quite rhyme. There were internal rhymes. But it was stanzas, verses. And it brings me neatly to the point that Dory and I talked a lot about poetry. In fact, she introduced me to some of the Scottish poets she loved long before I went to live in Scotland. People like Norman MacCaig, Edwin Muir, names might be familiar to you. And she read a lot of poetry. And she also knew at that time that I'd begun to write a lot of poetry for myself and to be published and to publish work myself. So she knew of my interest. And I last saw her in 2005. And I took my husband to meet her. I wanted Raymond to meet her before we moved. I moved to Scotland because she was getting on a bit, and I wanted her to meet him and him to meet her. She was such an important part of my life. So I saw her in 2005, but our talks continued by phone. And in 2007, after I'd gone to live in Scotland, I published a very small booklet of poems called Heartwood, which was about trees. I was part of a group of artists in Liddesdale. We put on an exhibition at one of the artist studios, Annette Jeffrey, some of you might know. She used to live in Ilkley. We put on an exhibition called The Secret Life of Trees. And the artists encouraged me to put this out at the time. And I wrote some poems, particularly about a very, very old oak tree on the land belonging to the friend who is still living in Liddesdale. And I wrote a poem in that collection in which I recall a conversation I had with Dorry on the phone, probably the last one I had. And it was before I married, and I was trying to work in Yorkshire, organise selling a house, organise moving to Scotland, and trying to get work in Scotland all at the same time. So it was a crazy time. And I really didn't have time to write the poems I was wanting to write by this time. And I was talking about this on the phone. And she gave me some very, very good advice. And I put it into one of the poems that's in the book. It's called Two Voices. One voice is Dorry's. The other voice is this extraordinary, venerable oak on the land in Bridge. And it's the two voices. And I'm going to just read the two voices, the first two stanzas of it to finish my talk. Well, not quite finished. These two voices are very important to me. So I'll just read them to you. Two voices. She sounds so old when I phone. Her laughter trembles with all the tones and rhythms of her life. While her world slowly stumbles her towards its finale, she takes joy in waking and making much of my news. Oh, that's marvellous that you should find love at this stage. She means this age. Now, when you can't write, remember, living is the thing. She sits with her friends, the poets, hears the music she has loved. Though she can hardly see, she paints ghostly notes from her threadbare pulse. And shortly after we married, I received a parcel from her. And in it was this tiny little painting as a wedding present. It's called Warm Rain. It's just a couple, as you'll see. Come and enjoy it. I see it every day like I do the horn player. And every day I remember her advice. Living is the thing. Thank you for listening.